You grow up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, where the radiator bangs all winter and the super fixes it sometime in spring. Your mother cleans offices in Midtown. She leaves at 5 in the morning and comes back after you're already in bed, and the evidence of her day is a uniform hanging on the bathroom door that smells like someone else's carpet cleaner. Your father is around until you're 11, and then he isn't. Not dead, just elsewhere. A different borough, a different woman, a different set of problems he finds more interesting than yours. You don't hate him for it, you file it. Store it somewhere useful. Anger is only energy if you know where to point it. You are good at math the way some kids are good at lying. Naturally, without effort, in a way that makes other people slightly uncomfortable. Your 6th grade teacher puts you in the back of the class with a textbook 2 years ahead of your grade because she doesn't know what else to do with you. You finish it in 3 weeks. She gets you another one, you finish that too. By 8th grade, you are doing calculus on a school-issued laptop held together with electrical tape, watching MIT lectures on YouTube at midnight because the library closes at 6 and the apartment Wi-Fi is faster after your mother goes to sleep. The scholarship comes from a program nobody in your building has heard of, a foundation that sends kids from specific zip codes to specific schools if the test scores are high enough. Your scores are high enough. Your school counselor, a tired woman named Mrs. Okafor, who has seen too many of these applications go nowhere, reads your file and calls your mother in and says she has never in 14 years recommended a student for this program, but she is recommending you. Your mother cries in the office. You don't. You shake Mrs. Okafor's hand and thank her and walk home and sit at the kitchen table and do the math on what this means. It means you get out. The school is in Connecticut, brick buildings and old money and boys who have last names you've seen on museum wings. You arrive with 2 suitcases and a financial aid package that covers tuition and nothing else. Your roommate's parents drop him off in a Range Rover and spend 40 minutes arranging his desk accessories. Your mother takes the train up. She brings you a sandwich in a Ziploc bag and straightens your collar and tells you to call her every Sunday. She doesn't cry this time. She saves it for the train ride home. You find this out later from a woman who sat next to her on the Metro North. The woman sends your mother a note. Your mother keeps it in her wallet for years. You are not the smartest person at this school. That is the first useful thing you learn. There are kids here who have been tutored since age 4, who speak 3 languages, who have already interned at their father's firms. They are not smarter than you. They are further ahead. The distinction matters and you carry it everywhere. You study like studying is the only thing standing between you and the Bronx radiator. In your first semester, you finish top of your class in mathematics and economics. In your second semester, you finish top of everything. A teacher named Mr. Hargreaves pulls you aside in March of your sophomore year. He teaches finance elective on Friday afternoons to a room of 12 students who all have fathers in the industry. He tells you you think differently from the other students. Not better, differently. You see patterns where they see numbers. That's rarer than you think. He hands you a book, a battered copy, pages flagged with post-it notes. The author's name means nothing to you then. It will mean everything later. You read it in 2 nights, you read it again, more slowly. Something opens up in your understanding of how the world actually works versus how people say it works. The 2 maps are not the same map. That gap between them is where money is made. You get into Wharton. Full scholarship, first person from your building, first person from your high school in 11 years. Mrs. Okafor sends you a card.
$10.
It has a $10
You
bill
don't spend
inside.
it.
You don't spend it. Wharton is a machine for sorting people into the correct boxes. The box you're supposed to go into is consulting or corporate finance. Safe, respectable, good money by normal standards. But you have spent 4 years watching normal standards from close range, and what you have noticed is that normal standards are designed by people who already have enough to keep people like you from wanting too much. You want too much. You have always wanted too much. You don't apologize for it. You cold email 42 hedge funds in the summer before your senior year. You research each one before you write. Not the fund strategy. They're people. Who came from where? Who came from nothing? Who had something to prove? You find patterns. 3 funds on your list were started by people who grew up poor. You write those 3 emails differently, more direct, less performed. You say exactly what you are and exactly what you want and exactly why you will be worth more than they pay you. 2 of them don't reply. 1 of them does. The reply comes from a man named Vic. 2 lines. Come in Thursday at 7, not 7 a.m., just 7. You find out when you arrive that it means 7 a.m. The office is already full. Vic runs a mid-size long-short equity fund out of a building in Midtown that doesn't have the fund's name anywhere in the lobby. No logo, no reception desk, a keypad, and a frosted glass door. Inside, rows of monitors, people who look like they haven't slept since Tuesday, the smell of coffee and something sharper underneath it. Vic is 50, compact, moves fast, shakes your hand without looking at you, and starts talking before you're fully seated. He asks you 3 questions, 2 about markets, 1 about you. The one about you is, what do you do when you're wrong? You say, I find out why as fast as possible, and I update. He looks at you properly for the first time. You're hired. Summer analyst, no ceremony, back to the monitors. The summer is 10 weeks of 16-hour days, and an education that Wharton could not have given you. Not the math. You already have the math. The psychology. You learn that markets are not rational systems temporarily disrupted by human emotion. They are emotional systems temporarily constrained by logic. You learn that the edge isn't information. Everyone has information. The edge is knowing what other people will do with the same information before they do it. You learn that Vic reads people the way you read numbers, patterns, inconsistencies, the gap between what someone says and what their position implies. You are very good at the math. You are better at the gap. Vic offers you a full-time position before the summer ends. You haven't graduated yet. He doesn't care. You negotiate your salary. Not aggressively, precisely. You know the number, you say the number. He adds 15% and tells you not to tell anyone what you make. You don't. The first 2 years are the best kind of hard. Everything is a problem you can solve if you think long enough and sleep short enough. Your analyst class is 8 people. 5 of them are gone by the end of year 2. Not fired, burned out. The hours are not the hard part. The hard part is the psychological cost of being wrong with other people's money. The first time you take a position that loses the fund, $2 million in an afternoon, you sit in the bathroom for 6 minutes doing the arithmetic on whether this ends your career. Then you go back to your desk and close the position and write the postmortem and send it to Vic before he asks for it. He reads it, comes to your desk and says, "Good. You know what you did. That's worth more than the $2 million. You double the fund's return in your 3rd year, not alone, your team. But the ideas that generated the outsized returns are yours, and Vic knows it, and the people who matter in this building know it. You are 26 years old, and you manage a book that most people will never see the number on in their entire lives. The money changes things in ways you didn't predict. Not the spending. You don't spend it. Not on the things people expect. No car, no watch collection. You move to a better apartment. You set up a fund for your mother so she never has to clean another office. She protests for 2 weeks and then accepts it and quits and takes a ceramics class on Tuesday mornings, which is the thing she mentioned wanting to do once. In passing, when you were 9 and you stored it. You remember. You always remember. What the money changes is the room you're allowed into. Suddenly, there are dinners with people whose names you have only seen on Bloomberg terminals. Men who manage 10 times what Vic manages. Men who talk about governments the way normal people talk about neighbors. You sit at these tables and you listen and you learn that there is a level above this one and a level above that, and at each level the rules change, and the thing you thought the game was turns out to have been a much smaller game inside a larger one. You meet a woman named Claire at one of these dinners. She's a lawyer. Corporate, the kind of precise intelligence that operates entirely differently from yours and finds yours interesting for the same reason. You date for 8 months before you admit to yourself you're in love with her, which takes that long because love is not a variable you were taught to account for, and it keeps showing up in your models and skewing the results. She finds this analysis of your own feelings hilarious. You find her finding it hilarious, the closest thing to peace you have felt since your mother's ceramics class. You get married in a small ceremony. Her parents, your mother. Mrs. Okfor sends a card, still no $10 bill. You put the card on your desk at the office between the monitors where other people put photos of their kids. The opportunity comes when you are 31. Vic is stepping back, not retiring, stepping back. The fund will continue, but under new leadership, and the board wants internal promotion, and the name that keeps coming up is yours. The conversation with Vic is short. He says, "You're ready." You say, "I know." He says, "The job is different from the analyst job. The analyst job is about being right. This job is about managing people who need to be right. You understand the difference?" You say yes. You think you mean it. You don't understand the difference. Not yet. Running the fund is a different animal. The markets are the same. The people are not. You have 12 portfolio managers now. 11 of them are excellent. One of them is a man named Rowan, who has been at the fund longer than you and expected to be sitting in your chair, and makes this known in every meeting through silences and questions that are not really questions. You manage him the way you manage a bad position, carefully, without emotion, watching for the moment to close. The moment comes in month 7. His numbers are down. You sit him down. You give him the data. He leaves the building that afternoon. You write the postmortem the same way you always do. Vic reads it and says, "Good. You know what you did. Returns are strong. The fund grows. You are on the correct lists and in the correct rooms, and your name is attached to the correct outcomes. Claire is pregnant, a boy. You choose a name together at a kitchen table at midnight over takeout containers, and it is the best meeting you have ever been in. You say this to her, She says, "That's the saddest compliment I've ever received." You both laugh. You make a note to give her fewer compliments that start with financial comparisons. The note is on your phone between two trade ideas. The FBI comes on a Tuesday, not to you first, to someone 2 steps removed. A former analyst who left 3 years ago and apparently kept in touch with people he shouldn't have. They start pulling threads. The threads connect to threads. One of them has your name on it, not because you did what they think you did, because someone who did what they think you did sat at a dinner table with you in 2021 and had a conversation that, taken out of context and rendered on a document by a prosecutor with a theory, looks like something it was not. You hire lawyers, the best lawyers. You pay the kind of money for legal counsel that other people pay for houses. Your lawyers say, "This is manageable." They say, "You didn't do anything wrong." They say, "We can make this go away." What they don't say, but what you understand from the math of it, is that making it go away has a cost that isn't paid in dollars. It's paid in what you sign, what you confirm, whose name appears in what document in exchange for yours disappearing from the wrong one. You tell Claire everything on a Sunday evening. You sit at the same kitchen table where you named your son, and you lay it out like a post-mortem. Here's the position. Here's how we got here. Here's the range of outcomes. She listens without speaking until you're finished. Then she says, "Did you do it?" You say no. She is quiet for a long time. She says, "I believe you." And then, "But I need to know if the version of you that ran that fund for 5 years is someone I would have married if I'd met him then." Not the answer to the legal question, the other question. You don't answer that night. You think about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, you try to answer it, and you realize you don't know. The man who sat at dinners with people who talked about governments like neighbors. The man who closed Rowan in 7 months without losing a night of sleep. The man who keeps a card from a school counselor on his desk, not for sentiment, but as a reminder of the distance he has traveled and therefore how far he has to fall. You don't know if Claire would have married that man. You don't know if you would have wanted her to. The fund is suspended, pending investigation. Your assets are frozen. The apartment stays yours. The lawyers stay hired. Your name is in the news on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday there are 7 missed calls from people you thought were friends, and 1 from your mother who doesn't understand what she read but knows something is wrong from the way you sound in her voicemail. You call her back. She picks up on the first ring. You tell her the version you can tell. She is quiet in the way she is always quiet when she is thinking carefully. Then she says, "You came from nothing, and that means something. But you have to remember what the nothing felt like, because the people on the other side of this decision, the lawyers, the prosecutors, the board, none of them remember. You do. Don't forget it in the room. You don't forget it in the room. The settlement is not what your lawyers wanted. It is not what the prosecutors wanted either. It is what it is. A document that closes a door and opens nothing. You do not go to prison. You are permanently barred from managing outside capital. The fund is dissolved. The returns you generated over 8 years are real. They happened. The number is on a document somewhere in a filing cabinet. The fund is gone. You are 34 years old. Claire stays. For a while, she stays. The version of staying that follows the investigation is a different thing from the version before it. Something in the foundation shifted, and you both know it, and you are both trying to stand on it anyway because your son is 2 and deserves a table where his parents eat dinner together. You try. She tries. The trying is visible, and that visibility is its own kind of damage. She leaves on a Friday when your son is 3. She is not cruel about it. She is precise about it. She takes your son to her parents in New Jersey, and she sends you a text that is 4 sentences long. And the 4th sentence is, "I need you to understand that I don't think you're a bad person. I think you became a different one." The text arrives at 7 a.m. You are already awake. You are always already awake. You drive to New Jersey on a Sunday and sit in a park with your son for 2 hours. He is 3, and the park is enough. He doesn't know about the fund or the lawyers or the document in the filing cabinet. He knows the slide and the ducks on the pond, and that his father pushes the swing higher than his mother does. You push the swing. He says higher. You push it higher. He laughs. You think about a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx and a radiator that banged all winter and a mother who left at 5 in the morning and came back after you were in bed, and you think about how far you have come from that apartment and how much of what you built is gone, and whether the distance between those 2 points adds up to anything. You drive home. You sit in the apartment. The monitors are still there. Nobody has asked for them back. You turn one on. The markets are open. The numbers move. You watch the patterns form and dissolve the way you always have, the way you did at midnight in the Bronx on a laptop held together with electrical tape, and you feel the old pull, clean and familiar, the only feeling that has always been exactly what it said it was. You close the monitor. You don't call anyone. There is nobody to call. The rooms you were in closed when your name changed in the news. The people at those dinner tables where men talked about governments like neighbors are at different dinner tables now, with someone new who is on the correct lists and in the correct rooms. and attached to the correct outcomes. That's how it works. The room doesn't miss you, it fills. You have your mother, you have Sunday afternoons in a park in New Jersey. You have a son who doesn't yet know what you did or what was done to you, or where the line between those two things actually runs. Someday he'll ask. You'll have to have an answer that is true and not just accurate. You haven't found it yet. Somewhere in the Bronx right now, a kid is doing math at midnight on a laptop held together with electrical tape. He is very good at it. He can see the patterns. He thinks the patterns are the point. He doesn't know yet that the patterns are just the entry fee. He doesn't know what the room costs. He'll find out. They always do. That's a wrap. The story is fiction, but the fund is real. The room is real, and the gap between what Wall Street promises and what it takes. That gap doesn't appear in any prospectus. If this made you think, drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. Subscribe for more. See you in the next one.